Chair, and as always through you, I'll be happy to ask the professor some questions. I appreciated his presentation today. I think that, one of the things that I spend a lot of time considering and have heard from many Indigenous leaders across Canada is the fact that our democracy was very much built on and continues to be built on a colonial practice that often silences the voices of the first people of this land. And when we talk about fairness, when we talk about looking at democracy in a new way, I think it's very important that we never forget those voices and how they've been isolated. And I think of the many communities that I represent, and when there is an election within their own community, of course, we see between a 90 to 95% participation rate, meaning very much that Indigenous communities are very connected to a democratic system. What they're not connected to in the same way, I think, is the Canadian democratic system. And part of that is based in the lack of representation. So we know that the House of Commons largely runs on a representation by population basis. But there are exceptions, like the one that you spoke of earlier about provinces having no less House of Commons seats than Senate seats. And I'm just wondering, in that context, is it important for us to explore representation in a broader context, especially around the First Peoples of Canada? I know there's been a lot of discussion about how those voices can be amplified, and the system right now, of course, sort of leaves it up to parties to nominate people and bring forward those voices. But should there be seats in our Parliament and in our Senate that are set aside specifically for Indigenous communities and making sure that those voices are heard?
Je remercie Madame la Présidente, la députée, pour cette question.
Madam Chair, I'd like to thank the member for her question. Now, what I had said initially had to do with the very delicate issue of Quebec's demographic weight, which has been declining steadily since 1967. But there's also Indigenous representation in the House of Commons, which is of utmost importance. And this confirms the problem that I've been underscoring, and that is that this country, this federation, cannot indefinitely forego certain debates. We can't put these debates off any longer. Now, to create a relationship on an equal-to-equal basis, this is something that cannot be done unless there are certain constitutional debates. And I think that one day we may have to, perhaps have a certain number, a certain space for Indigenous persons in the Senate, in the House of Commons. These are issues that have to be looked at. But if there are wins for some people, this should not be to the detriment of other people. This has to be looked at from a very broad perspective and other than the electoral map, because we have to have greater Indigenous representation in federal institutions and at the same time provincializing our Senate and making changes to seat distribution in the House of Commons. I think that the question of Indigenous representation could be added to our debate. Otherwise, we'll fall into an area of constitutional taboos where we can't deal with certain changes. We cannot indefinitely put these debates off.
Your comments on that, and you have talked several times about having this debate on the Constitution, which I think would be an interesting thing to move forward with. But I guess where I'm sort of curious is what other countries have had this kind of debate. Is there particular models that you think are more meaningful? I think as we talk about representation, that is something that is incredibly important. You know, there are a lot of identities in Canada. That's something that Canadians are proud of, but I don't think we always amplify the voices that we should. We look at our federal systems, we still see continuously that the people that are most prominent continue to be male and continue to be white and straight often. So if we're going to talk about how to represent identity, how to make sure those voices are heard in a more profound way, and you're talking specifically about a debate in this sort of constitutional realm, so can you tell us what would that format look like? Has other countries done it more effectively than others? And if you have any examples for us, and I think you will answer that and my time will be done.
Deux choses sur l'aspect droit comparatif.
Two things. In terms of comparative law, I don't have a perfect example at hand that might answer your question. But with respect to Indigenous issues, we might look at Australia and New Zealand, which are dealing with similar difficulties and similar challenges. But both Canada and these countries perhaps could look to each other for inspiration. Now, with respect to the debate, the constitutional debate, the text of C-14 already amounts to a constitutional debate. Its very wording says that from now on, the 1867 Constitution Act will have to be interpreted in a certain way. But this is complex. There are all kinds of rules, such that only the Canadian government could amend it, or that it takes the agreement of 7 provinces representing 50% of the population. But given our history and our political difficulties, we have a tendency to sweep under the carpet any questions which might affect the federal government's unilateral power. But here with C-14, this might be something that we could use, but I think we're preventing ourselves from taking another path, perhaps a path, the path of the federal government acting alone